Chrighton Abbey had belonged to the family for generations, and Squire Chrighton was a respected power in that remote western region of England, owning all the land in the parish. Sarah Chryston's father had been a distant relation of the squire and a rector of the parish, whose demise had left Sarah completely unprovided for. Her mother having passed years before, she had no near relations left in England and decided to seek employment abroad. She worked first as a governess in Vienna for 7 years, then when her pupils had grown up, moved to a more profitable position in St Petersburg, where she remained for another 5. Sarah then decided to treat herself to a holiday in her home country, revisiting friends and family. Mrs Chryston, the squire's wife, had also written her cordial letters begging her to pay a long visit to the abbey should she return. At Christmas, she wrote, they were receiving many guests, and her son Edward would be introducing his fiancée Julia Tremaine to the family. The cheerful letter decided Sarah, and by early December she was being welcomed into Chrighton Abbey by the housekeeper, Mrs Marjoram, whom she had known as a child. She was taken to a cosy tapestry bedroom in the old wing. This looked out over the stable yard, unused for years, after new stables were built at the other end of the house. Mrs Chryston soon appeared and took Sarah to meet her grown-up cousins, expressing great pride in her handsome son Edward, but without much to say about his fiancée. Julia Tremaine was, however, also very striking, although with a pride and coldness with which she seemed to sum up Sarah as a poor relation and a frump. As Edward and his 2 sisters surrounded Sarah with excitement, chatting of childhood memories, Julia watched with a disdainful expression and derisive comments that soon put an end to their talk of the past. The following morning, Sarah again looked down from her window onto the old stables and remembered family legends. When asked about the unused stables, now called the North Quadrangle, Mrs Chryston had had a strange look of fear cross her face. Sarah recalled that there was no longer hunting from the house since 2 generations ago, when the then squire had sold the pack of hounds. Sarah's cousin George Chrighton, the reigning lord, had a secret horror of the sport, as more than one family descendant had perished untimely in the hunting field. On many occasions, a violent death had come between the heir and his inheritance, and Mrs Chryston one day listed them for Sarah. An ancient Hugh had been taken in a duel, John was fatally injured hunting 30 years later, Theodore was accidentally fired on by a fellow Eton schoolmate, and Jasper's yacht had gone down in the Mediterranean 40 years ago. Despite the arguments between Edward and Julia, Mrs Chryston was relieved that he was to be safely married soon. Julia refused to participate in outdoor sports, party games and soirees, and even in the traditional Christmas delivery of gifts to the poor of the parish, although she did take Sarah aside and ask her to secretly distribute gold sovereigns to the cottagers on her behalf. She oddly made Sarah promise not to tell Edward, despite the pair becoming increasingly estranged. In the chill between them, Edward finally decided to set off for 3 days of hunting with an old school friend in Wycherley, 25 miles away. Sarah was dismayed at his plan, fearful of his mother's reaction, given the family's dislike of the sport, and that he would not be back in time for the New Year's ball. Mrs Chryston later told Sarah that she would not interfere with his enjoyment and had confidence in his riding skills. As dusk fell that evening, Sarah was resting in her room when she was startled by a sound that was not familiar to her. It was a huntsman's horn, a few plaintive notes which had a strange faraway sound and continued in a ghastly melody. As the fire in her room died, Sarah stood transfixed in the gloom, when suddenly a light flashed through the window and onto the wall before her. Sarah ran to the window and saw that the great gates of the stable yard were open, and men in scarlet coats were riding in. A pack of hounds crowded in before them, the whole scene dimly visible by the weird gleams of the lantern carried by one of the men. As the stable doors opened, gentlemen and grooms alighted from their horses, the dogs were driven into their kennel, and helpers hurried to and fro. However, there was no sound of horse's hoof, human voice, or yelping hound. The faint, faraway sounds of the horn had died out in the distance, and the whole scene played out in ghastly silence. Sarah watched as the horses were stabled, redcoats strolled out the gates, and the grooms departed, like a completely natural scene. However, she knew that the stable yard and its buildings had stood disused for more than half a century. An utter unbeliever in ghostly things, she wondered if a neighbourhood hunting party had sought shelter from the rain there. But when she thought of the awful sound of the horn, then strange unearthly gleam of the lantern, and the eerie noiselessness, a cold sweat stood out on her forehead, and she trembled in every limb. After some minutes of standing statue-like, staring blankly into the empty quadrangle, Sarah ran down a back staircase to the servants' quarters, determined to ask Mrs. Marjoram the meaning of what she had seen. Still pale and trembling, she asked the kindly housekeeper if she had just heard a huntsman's horn. It was Mrs. Marjoram's turn for her face to fall in horror as, in a strange voice, she asked Sarah what she had seen. Sarah described the dogs, horses, gentlemen in red coats, and in particular one tall man with grey hair and whiskers and a stoop in his shoulders. Sarah had noticed that he wore a short waisted coat with a very high collar, a coat that looked 100 years old. "The old squire," Mrs. Marjoram was heard to mutter under her breath, but then insisted that Sarah must have been dreaming. The gates to the north quadrangle had been locked and barred for the last 40 years, and the only keys to them hung in her cupboard. Sarah equally insisted that the dogs and horses were now in the stables and kennels there, and said that she would check with the rest of the family. But Mrs. Marjoram seized her by the wrist and begged her not to breathe a word to them. Sarah had witnessed what always brings misfortune and sorrow to the house. She had seen the dead, the old squire who had lost his eldest son on the hunting field and subsequently sold all the dogs and horses and locked the north quadrangle from that day. Mrs. Marjoram explained that she had been a girl when the apparition had last been seen by a visitor to the house. Before the week was out, the then master was struck by an incapacity and never spoke or knew anyone afterwards. There were other stories from honest people, all proving that the appearance of the old squire and his pack is a warning of death to this house. She pleaded with Sarah not to tell the Chrightons of her sighting, which would make them nervous and unhappy, while nothing within human power could prevent what evil was to come upon the house. Sarah now felt burdened by a strange morbid dread of coming misery, and she noticed that Mrs. Chrightons' face was graver than usual, as she was no doubt thinking of her son's intended visit to Wycherley. Despite regarding herself as an educated woman of the world, Sarah became terrified that her apparition was ominous of danger to Edward, and later in the evening she took Julia Tremaine aside and described her experience to her. Of course, Julia refused to try and deter Edward from his hunting trip. She did not believe in the supernatural, and after Edward's poor treatment of her during the week, she could not see him giving up the trip to please her. The next day, Sarah heard that Edward had departed for Wycherley soon after daybreak. She continued to brood over the housekeeper's words that the spectres she had seen boded death and sorrow to the house of Chrighton. However, the whole household was now full of excitement about the New Year's ball. It was to be a very grand affair, with many guests coming from a great distance. By New Year's morning, Sarah was looking forward to the unspeakable relief of seeing Edward safely home, and noticed that Julia proceeded to sit all day in a window that commanded a view of the long winding drive leading to the front of the Abbey. By 10 o'clock, a throng of elegantly dressed guests was crowding the staircase, while the high-class visitors continued to arrive. But Edward Chrighton had not appeared amongst them. Despite her gracious smiling, Mrs. Chrightons had momentarily looked anguished in Sarah's direction. She was worried about her son. Something had happened to him. Sarah did her best to comfort her, but her own heart was growing heavier. Julia danced at first, then sat out the rest of the evening as if still awaiting Edward. At one stage, Sarah caught a glimpse of a man, not dressed for the occasion, in the hallway, who then disappeared. It was only at the end of the night, as the Chrightons sat exhausted, that the butler, with a solemn, anxious face, announced that there was a person wishing to see them. Edward had been thrown from his horse in a steeplechase at Wycherley. Beside the course was a heavy stone roller, on which he had fallen head first. Edward had passed while they were carrying him to his host's house. Edward had been planning to return home to the ball after the race, but, as predicted in Sarah's ghastly vision, misfortune had again befell the Chrightons.